On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Indiana County, I welcome you to our presentation, The Fight for the Right to Vote. My name is Ann Simmons. This centennial celebration reminds us that 100 years have passed since the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting American women suffrage, the right to vote in political elections. This presentation has been prepared by the members of the League of Women Voters of Indiana County. Our presentation will include information about voting in Pennsylvania, as well as stories of women's suffrage.
Governor Wolf signed the PA Act 77 in 2019, which made voting more convenient and more secure. It was a bipartisan compromise that took effect April 2020 for the primary election. Pennsylvania was a national leader with these reforms. It created a new option to vote by mail, where you could be placed on a list to do so permanently. You had more time to register. You can register up to 15 days instead of 30 before election. You can submit mail-in and absentee ballots until 8 p.m. on election day. And the act also funded the new voting system. The emergency absentee ballot process is also now more streamlined. You can vote by going to the polling place, you can vote by ballot, or you can vote by a provisional ballot. So what's the difference between mail-in and absentee ballots? Well, of course, you have to be registered to vote for either, but anyone qualified to vote may apply for a mail-in ballot with no reason given. If you plan to be away on election day, if you have a registered disability or illness, you can request an absentee ballot. That also would apply to college students, work or vacation, military, religious, or inmates not convicted of a felony. The deadline for an absentee ballot to be in is 8 p.m. on election day. If the county receives your ballot by the deadline, you may not vote at the polling place. However, if you're not sure if your mail-in or absentee ballot was received, you can vote provisionally at the polling place. However, it will be checked. That applies to both mail-in and absentee voting. Some important dates to remember. Well, for the November 3rd election, October 19th, you have to be registered to vote by this date. A note though, if you are not a US citizen and a resident of Pennsylvania at least 30 days before the next election, you cannot register to vote. October 27th, applications for mail-in ballots must be received by 5 p.m. and November 3rd, ballots must be received by 8 p.m. A little more about mail-in voting. Don't forget, you can mail it or drop it off in the 2 envelopes provided. Now, where to drop it off will vary depending to your county. You may have a drop-off box, or you may have to take it into the county election office, or you can also take it to the polling place. The biggest question everyone has is voting safe? Each mail-in ballot includes a barcode so that only one ballot per voter can be counted. This barcode is unique and can be tracked by both you and our county election officials. The votespa.com website will provide you with the date your ballot is received and its status. The signature on your mail-in ballot must also match your voting record signature, the same as if you were going in person on election day. So how do you apply? Well, you can apply online at votespa.com, and you can either do absentee or mail-in. You can apply in person. And for either one, you will need a valid PA driver's license or a PennDOT photo ID. You can apply by mail by downloading and printing the application, or you can contact your county office directly and request a paper application. If you're military, I would advise you to go to the webpage for more information. In summary, remember those important dates. And if you need help with applying for ballots, checking your status, registering to vote, finding your office, and a wealth of information about voting, go to votespa.com. Remember to put the S at the end of votes, votespa.com. It's also important to know about the candidates in any election. The League of Women Voters can help with that at Vote 411 and at the League of Women Voters websites. All right, now Donna is next, and you're going to learn more about our right to vote.
Until well into the 19th century, American women's lives were governed by the English common law heritage of coverture, which held that no female had a legal identity. She could not own property, and any inheritance or wages she earned legally belonged to her husband or guardian. She had no rights to her own children or to her own body. Her husband or guardian had complete control of her life, even the authority to confine her or to inflict physical assault. Although women such as Abigail Adams in colonial America wrote deploring men's unlimited power, it was a meeting of 5 women over tea in the summer of 1848 that kicked off a movement for women's equal rights in America. The 5, all active in the movement to end slavery, met in the home of Jane Hunt in Western New York State. Hunt and Marianne McClintock, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and sisters Martha Wright and Lucretia Mott shared their frustration that the movement to abolish slavery did not extend to ending the oppression of women. They planned a regional convention to discuss the condition and rights of women to be held in nearby Seneca Falls, New York. Stanton and Mott admired the social and political culture of the native clans in Western New York State. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois nations, included the Seneca and Oneida peoples. Names, property, and clan membership were transmitted through their maternal lines. Matriarchs held political power, choosing their clan leaders. Lucretia Mott observed Seneca women in decision-making roles as the Seneca Nation developed and adopted a constitution that retained the tradition of women's full involvement. Stanton's and Mott's friendships with Seneca and Oneida women inspired their vision of a society in which women had the same rights and responsibilities as men. Stanton drafted a Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, to be read and discussed at the Seneca Falls Convention. This document outlined how legal constrictions and abuses of women denied them the inalienable rights endowed by their creator. It listed conditions that deprived women of rights to their own bodies, to their children, their wages, and property. It asserted rights to educational and occupational opportunity and equal status in religious and social life. It lamented women's lack of representation in making laws, insisted on full citizens' rights for women, and declared the intent to gain these rights. The convention met in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls in July 1848. The event was advertised in the Seneca County Courier only a few days before. In spite of this limited publicity, about 300 people crowded into the chapel on the first day, including 42 men. The region was home to many active abolitionists who were sympathetic to women's rights and other progressive social reforms. Among the attendees was abolitionist and former slave Frederick Douglass. Making her first public speech as a movement leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton opened the proceedings by reading the Declaration of Sentiments. Discussion and debate filled the rest of the first convention day. Frederick Douglass opened the second day with a powerful speech that linked gaining freedom for slaves with gaining rights for women. After more speeches and debate, closing speaker Lucretia Mott presented a resolution that success in securing rights and opportunities for women depended on the zealous and untiring efforts of both men and women. The Declaration of Sentiments was signed by 68 women and 32 men attending. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first of many women's rights conventions that met in that region and beyond, growing into a national movement as other dynamic leaders such as Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Gage joined forces with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Over the next decades, the movement saw divisions and regroupings as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed without women gaining their full rights of citizenship. It would be up to a new generation to carry on this fight. Let's go back to Ann Simmons for a look at how women's movement progressed.
Abolitionists worked to end slavery, and suffragists advocated for suffrage, the right to vote. Depicted in the slide are a few of the most notable abolitionists and suffragists. Starting at the top and moving clockwise are Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth. The two movements, anti-slavery and women's rights, were closely aligned. In 1866, these reformers founded the American Equal Rights Association with the purpose of securing equal rights for all Americans, especially the right to vote, irrespective of race, color, or sex. In the decades before the Civil War, the campaign for women's suffrage was small, but continued to grow. However, this momentum was lost during the Civil War. Interestingly, both men and women served in the Civil War. For example, women worked as nurses and even as Army scouts or spies. Therefore, both men and women influenced the outcome of the Civil War. During this same time period, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granted Black men the right to vote. This granting of suffrage to Black men and not to women led to a major conflict. In 1869, the members of the American Equal Rights Association split into two groups, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association. As you can see, Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass continued as leaders in the American Women's Suffrage Association, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony continued as leaders in the National Women's Suffrage Association. The two groups differed in their support or opposition to the 15th Amendment, as well as in their strategy to pass an amendment to the United States Constitution. Moreover, these groups differed in other ways. The American Women's Suffrage Association was the more moderate of the two groups, focusing on the right of women to vote. In addition, this group included many female as well as male reformers. On the other hand, the members of the National Women's Suffrage Association, who adamantly opposed the passage of the 15th Amendment and felt betrayed by their fellow reformers, were perceived as the more radical of the two groups. The National Women's Suffrage Association, with predominantly female members, focused on a woman's right to vote, as well as other rights for women, including things like the right to an education. Interestingly, only 9 years after they parted, the former Friends and Allies came back together to form the NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association. It was actually the daughter of Lucy Stone, Alice Stone, who brought the two groups back together. As you can see from the diagram, the journey of the women's suffrage movement was not without conflict. The initial leaders of the women's suffrage movement included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass. They were considered first-generation suffragists. As we move through the next part of the presentation, we will focus on the second generation of suffragists who were prominent during the Progressive Era, the time period from approximately 1890 to 1920. Our next speaker, Susan Welsh, will speak to you about Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells was born in Mississippi in 1862. She was barely 3 when the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was passed. She experienced and witnessed the turbulent era of Reconstruction. At age 16, Ida took on the roles of caregiver and elementary school teacher when her parents died of yellow fever. In 1880, the remaining family members moved to Memphis. Ida took another teaching job and began to publish in the Black newspaper presses. In 1889, at age 27, she became the editor and the owner of a Black newspaper, the Free Speech and Headlight. It had a large circulation. Ida's leadership in a campaign for anti-lynching legislation began in 1892 when a neighbor in Memphis was lynched. Her work for this cause launched her career as an investigative journalist. She published 2 books on lynching. And over the next 4 years, 6 states adopted anti-lynching laws. In 1893, she moved to Chicago after the office of her newspaper was destroyed by arson, and she was warned not to return to Memphis. So in Chicago, Ida writes for an independent, nationally recognized Black newspaper, the Chicago Conservator. She uses the press to agitate for civil rights, including suffrage, and she conducts lecture tours to advocate for anti-lynching legislation. By 1895, her reputation is international. In 1895, she marries Ferdinand Barnett, a Chicago lawyer, activist, and editor. They have 4 children. And finally, in 1913, Ida was co-founder of the Chicago-based Alpha Suffrage Club, the ASC. This was the first Black women's suffrage club in Chicago. In 1886, the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW, became the largest federation of local Black women's clubs. As an organizer of local women's clubs herself, Ida attended the formation meetings and was a founding member. In 1909, Ida was a signee on the founding document of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Ida lobbied both organizations to keep a laser focus on legal reforms to address violence against African Americans. By 1910, leaders in the National American Women's Suffrage Association were focusing on the single issue of gender equality and were sidelining issues of racial equality. They did not want to jeopardize support, especially in the South. Let's get that vote first, then we'll work on race issues, said Susan B. Anthony, and Ida warned her that this strategy would only create more segregation. There were, in fact, efforts to exclude Black women from Nassau events. Ida, on the other hand, made efforts to publicly include Black women. 2 parades in 2013 marked those efforts. The first was the historic 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C. At this event, national suffrage leaders upheld the emphasis on appeasing the South. The leaders asked Black women in the various state contingents to leave their groups and march together at the back of the parade. Ida was livid. She had been working with Black and white suffragists for years. She left the staging area and waited along the parade route. When the Illinois contingent arrived, she slipped into the parade and marched with them arm in arm. The second 1913 parade was in Chicago, her hometown. Early in 1913, the Alpha Suffrage Club had worked with Black and white women in Illinois to educate and lobby for a state suffrage law that was just now coming up for a vote. The law passed in June, and the parade that celebrated its passage included 5 cars of Alpha Suffrage Club members. Ida, in fact, was the parade marshal. After Illinois' example, suffrage leader Carrie Chapman Catt said that suffrage sentiment had doubled overnight. The next slide shows Ida B. Wells alongside her fellow Illinois suffragists at the DC parade, and that is Ida at the center and her 2 friends to your left. Some of the highlights of Ida B. Wells-Barnett activism are listed here. Let's look at the second, which I've not mentioned yet. In 1910, Ida founded the Negro Fellowship League. It provided lodging and a resource center for Black men as they transitioned from parole or prison into employment in their communities. Wells was appointed probation officer working between the residents and the Chicago courts. The Alpha Suffrage Club's work continued, but now they could focus on education and registration of voters. Ida also established the first kindergarten for children of her community in the early 1920s. And in 1930, she ran as an independent candidate for Illinois state senator. She did not win that race, but as in all of her work, she created civic and legal pathways for others. In all of her work, she advocated for voter registration and voter education and voter activity after 1913. You will next hear from Kay Smith, and she will tell you about a woman on a white horse.
Inez Milholland, the woman on the white horse. She was a lawyer, journalist, orator, athlete, free lover, pacifist, and a labor activist, considered the most controversial and celebrated proponent of women's suffrage during her lifetime. During her attendance at Vassar College, she was considered an active radical. On her graduation in 1909, she applied for admission to Yale, Harvard, and Cambridge, but was denied by all three because of her gender. She graduated from New York University School of Law in 1912. In 1916, Milholland joined the other states, giving nearly 50 speeches on women's rights. She drew crowds because of her great oration wherever she went. In 1916, while on tour, an untreated infection of her tonsils had begun to poison her. She collapsed during an event in Los Angeles on election night in 1916 and died at the age of 30. March 1913, the eve of the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, as he quietly came into town via the back streets, because unawares to him, there was a big parade being formed a few blocks away. Inez was an imposing figure on her white horse, named Great Dawn, with long dark hair cascading down her back in contrast to the pure white cape she wore. All participants fell in line behind her as she led the parade of 5,000 marchers down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was the first national effort calling for a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. The parade was meticulously coordinated by Alice Paul. Women from many countries, every state, and various occupations had come by the thousands. Paul's intent was to attract the press, and she succeeded. The parade was peaceful for several blocks until they passed the Peace Monument and turned on Pennsylvania Avenue, where they found the route blocked by tens of thousands of angry and drunken men. Inez was a skilled equestrian, and being taller and faster in the saddle, she spurred her horse forward. The police were unable to provide adequate protection, and medical personnel were impeded by the crowd. About 300 marchers were rescued by the ambulance crews, and about 100 of those required hospitalization. It took 6 grueling hours for the marchers to reach the Treasury building. A worried and anxious audience who had been watching for the marchers were finally greeted by a gallant figure on a white horse, the courageous herald Inez Milholland. The parade she led was a success, a turning point in their movement. The mistreatment of the marchers became a major news story, and their cause gained sympathy. Congressional hearings were held, and 150 witnesses testified. The superintendent of DC Police lost his job as a result of his conduct before and during the march. The suffragists have made it clear that they would no longer be ignored, a promise they followed through with on years of clashing with Woodrow Wilson on behalf of suffrage, and in 1919 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And it's my pleasure to finally introduce as a final presenter, Ann Simmons, on protests and progress.
President Woodrow Wilson, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt all played prominent roles in the women's suffrage movement. This was a time of many protests as well as significant progress. Prior to his election to the presidency in 1912, Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton University and later the governor of New Jersey. During his presidency, Woodrow Wilson led the United States through World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, and was the leading architect of the League of Nations. The slide states that President Woodrow Wilson was not in favor of women's rights. Let me provide a little more detail. Personally, the president favored women's suffrage. However, politically, he was not in favor of women's rights because of the strong opposition to a women's suffrage constitutional amendment from politicians representing the southern states. Alice Paul was raised a Quaker in a household with the belief in equality between genders and races. This led to Alice Paul's conviction that women and men should be equal partners in society. She went to Swarthmore College and later University of Pennsylvania, where she earned both a master's degree and a PhD, a doctoral degree. She traveled to England and participated in the women's suffrage movement. At that time, the women's suffrage movement in England was more radical than the movement in the United States. While in England, Alice Paul was arrested for acts of civil disobedience and participated in hunger strikes while in prison. Alice Paul returned to the United States and became an active member of the NAWSA, the National Women's Suffrage Association. Alice Paul met with President Woodrow Wilson. He listened politely. However, Alice Paul could not convince him to support a women's suffrage constitutional amendment, an amendment granting women the right to vote. In time, Alice Paul's relationship with the president grew more adversarial. President Wilson's strategy was to intentionally ignore the suffragists. Alice Paul was passionate about the movement. Alice Paul's goals and tactics were no longer aligned with the leadership of the NAWSA. Alice Paul and other suffragists decided to work outside the system and formed a competing women's suffrage organization, the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party was considered the more radical of the two organizations. Other significant differences were in the strategies employed by each group. Also, historically, during the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement stopped. And during World War I, the NAWSA, National Women's Suffrage Association, made the decision to stop all women's suffrage events. Therefore, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party were perceived as unpatriotic. Alice Paul made the decision to strategically use tactics that President Woodrow Wilson could not ignore. In 1917, Alice Paul led the first ever picketers in front of the White House. The protesters served as a constant reminder to President Wilson of his lack of support for suffrage. At first, the picketers were tolerated, but they were later arrested on charges of obstructing traffic and given the choice of paying a fine or going to prison. The women chose to go to prison, where they began a hunger strike and then were force-fed in a cruel manner. The treatment of the women and the severe decline in their health while imprisoned led to a change in public sentiment. More and more people became sympathetic and changed their views from opposition to women's suffrage to support of women's suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt was another notable leader of the women's suffrage movement. She graduated from Iowa State University and worked as a teacher and later a school superintendent. Carrie Chapman Catt was president of the NAWSA from 1900 to 1904. Then Carrie Chapman Catt traveled around the world and led the international women's suffrage movement. The leadership of the NAWSA feared that Alice Paul was becoming too radical, and Chapman Catt returned to the United States. Chapman Catt again served as president of the NAWSA from 1915 to 1920. Carrie Catt, just like Alice Paul, was a very influential leader in the women's suffrage movement. However, the strategies and tactics employed by these women were not aligned. Chapman Catt nurtured a relationship with President Woodrow Wilson. Chapman Catt was invited to dinners at the White House, and she and the president corresponded on a regular basis by the exchange of letters. While Alice Paul was fighting directly for a national amendment, Chapman Catt exercised a more measured and patient strategy by gaining suffrage for women state by state. On the left side of the slide, you can see an image of a woman in the United States of America. The area depicted in white shows the states in the western part of the United States where women had already been granted the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson made a speech to Congress in 1918. In this speech, he said, "We have made partners of women." This strong support of the Women's Suffrage Amendment by the president was the result of the tremendous involvement of women in World War I. During World War I, it was women who drove the trucks, worked in the factories making the munitions, and helped to build the ships. Former suffragists also raised funds and supported the building of a hospital in France. It was former suffragists who were also the doctors and nurses providing medical care to American soldiers during World War I in Europe. In August 1920, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, granting women the right to vote. As you can see in the timeline across the bottom of the slide, in 1890, the NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was founded. The NAWSA was the leading suffrage organization for 30 years, from 1890 to 1920. And in 1917, you can see the formation of the National Women's Party. In 1920, when women won their fight for the right to vote, the NAWSA changed its name to the League of Women Voters. In 1920, the National American Women's Suffrage Association not only changed their name to the League of Women Voters, they also changed their mission from advocating for the right of women to vote to preparing women to vote as educated citizens. In the 1970s, the League of Women Voters opened its membership to men. Interestingly, the decision was made to retain the name of League of Women Voters to honor the woman who founded the League. More recently, in 1974, the League of Women Voters of Indiana County was chartered. We are nonpartisan and we continue the mission of preparing both women and men to vote as educated citizens. Special thanks to the Cambria County Library for inviting us to prepare this presentation. This opportunity to create a virtual presentation has been a fascinating project. I would also like to recognize the members of our league who contributed to the presentation: Donna Cashdollar, Peggy Iyer, Joyce Rizzo, Cindy Rogers, Ann Simmons, Kay Smith, and Sue Welsh. You are welcome to contact us. You can easily communicate with us via email, website, or Facebook. In closing, We hope you found our presentation interesting and informative, and we hope you have a wonderful day.